All right, let's just jump right in. Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're taking on a massive task, compressing 50,000 years of incredibly dense history to figure out exactly how one very fractured continent ended up shaping the modern world.
The big question we really need to answer is how scattered groups of hunter-gatherers managed to forge the most contested, fractured, and influential continent on Earth. And the secret to understanding this whole story? It's all about a pendulum. Europe's history is quite literally a relentless push and pull between forces desperately trying to unite it and forces completely tearing it apart. We're looking at a narrative of constant tension, from the very first human footprints all the way to the headlines we read today.
To wrap our heads around this massive timeline, we're going to break our journey into 6 distinct eras: antiquity and the Roman Empire, the Middle Ages and faith, rebirth and discovery, industry and empires, the devastation of total war, and finally, a divided and united continent.
Starting off with Section 1, Antiquity and the Roman Empire, the first great unification.
The sheer acceleration of human progress here is wild. I mean, we start 50,000 years ago with Paleolithic cave dwellers, right? And it takes tens of thousands of years before farming even shows up around 7,000 BC, which finally ends nomadic life. But then, things really speed up. Suddenly we jump to the 5th century BC, watching the brilliant but kind of fragile democratic experiment of ancient Greece unfold, and from there we accelerate straight into the 2nd century AD, hitting the Pax Romana, this crazy era of unprecedented peace and stability.
And the absolute crucial point for that Roman era is scale. Just think about this number: 5.9 million. At its peak, the Roman Empire covered a staggering 5.9 million square kilometers. That is massive. They weren't just conquering territory, they were actively connecting it. Rome brought written laws, sprawling road networks, and a common administrative language in Latin to a huge array of tribal cultures. It was basically the ultimate unification project.
But, empires never last forever. That brings us to Section 2, the Middle Ages and faith, collapse and reconsolidation.
After 476 AD, the continent violently fractured. It basically plunged straight into the Dark Ages, when Roman borders just completely broke under the weight of migrating Germanic tribes. But remember that pendulum? It eventually swings back. By 800 AD, we get a slow reconsolidation under Charlemagne's Frankish Empire. And at the exact same time, the unifying spiritual power of the Christian Church is taking deep root across all these brand new kingdoms.
So you end up with this massive, glaring contrast of finding medieval Europe. Over in the West, things have broken apart into these insular feudal kingdoms where the Catholic Church was pretty much the only game in town for literacy and law. But look over at the East. The Eastern Roman, or Byzantine Empire, was a totally different story. Centered in Constantinople, it was this wealthy, urbanized beacon of classical civilization, preserving ancient knowledge and building up the Orthodox Church.
Yet absolutely no amount of wealth or piety could stop the cataclysm of the 14th century, 1/3. The Black Death swept through and wiped out up to 1/3 of the entire European population. It's a genuinely harrowing number. But what's fascinating here is the economic aftermath. Because of massive labor shortages, this tragedy ironically handed surviving peasants brand new bargaining power, which effectively upended the strict old feudal system of lords and serfs.
Moving right along into Section 3, Rebirth, Reformation and Discovery, Expansion and Schism. Okay, so when Constantinople finally fell to the Ottoman Turks in 1453, fleeing Greek scholars brought all these precious ancient manuscripts to Italy, and that directly sparked the Renaissance, a literal rebirth of art and science. But as Johannes Gutenberg's printing press started spreading all these brilliant new ideas, it also fueled some serious religious dissent. By 1517, Martin Luther is directly challenging the church, and by 1618, those ideological tensions literally explode into the catastrophic 30 Years' War.
Luther's actions ended up permanently cleaving Western Christendom in half. A very stark geographic divide popped up. You had a staunchly Catholic South, anchored by places like Spain and Italy, pitted right against a rebellious Protestant North, spanning across Germany and the Low Countries. And this division unleashed a full century of sectarian bloodshed that permanently shattered Europe's spiritual unity.
Now, while European powers were busy tearing each other apart over religion at home, they were simultaneously looking outward. The so-called discovery of the Americas kicked off this completely new era of global empires. European nations extracted unbelievable amounts of wealth in gold and silver from indigenous civilizations.
But tragically, this immense global expansion relied entirely on the horrific transatlantic slave trade, setting up a brutal triangular trade network that ultimately birthed the early forms of global capitalism.
That sets the perfect stage for Section 4, Industry, Empires, and Revolution, the engines of modernity.
Here we hit a profound, ground-shaking shift. It starts with the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment philosophers who were championing reason and liberty. Those exact ideas directly inspired the bloody fight to dismantle absolute monarchy during the French Revolution in 1789. The chaos of those resulting wars allowed Napoleon to briefly conquer the continent before he was finally defeated in 1815. But that whole process birthed these fierce new national identities, eventually culminating in the unifications of Germany and Italy by 1871. Running completely parallel to those political upheavals was the Industrial Revolution. Talk about history's ultimate double-edged sword, right? On one hand, you get unimaginable technological progress, factories, and massive railway networks that basically conquered physical distance. But on the other hand, it created crushing urban poverty, severe pollution, and this intense inequality between the wealthy bourgeois class and the factory workers. That massive disparity directly birthed the socialist movement led by figures like Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. Meanwhile, this newly industrialized, hyper-competitive Europe launched a really aggressive, renewed push to imperially divide up Africa and Asia. Which unfortunately leads us right into Section 5, the devastation of total war. The pendulum swings to chaos. Because of a really complex, incredibly fragile web of alliances, a single political assassination in 1914 was transformed into a 4-year catastrophe, World War I. When the dust finally settled in 1918, ancient empires had literally collapsed. But that peace, it was incredibly fragile. The trauma of that defeat, combined with the Great Depression, paved the way for extremist ideologies, which ignited a second, even more devastating global conflict in 1939, ending only with the total collapse of Nazi Germany in 1945.
We really have to pause on this harrowing number, 6 million. Under the cover of that war, the Nazi regime implemented the Holocaust, systematically and ruthlessly murdering over 6 million Jews, alongside millions of Roma, disabled people, political prisoners, and so many others. It showcased the absolute darkest extremes of humanity, leaving a permanent, tragic scar on the continent's conscience.
Emerging physically and emotionally shattered in 1945, Europe entered a totally new phase. Section 6, a divided and united continent, the modern era.
It is crazy to watch how rapidly the continent transforms from there. We go from the tense, nuclear-armed divisions of the Cold War, which was perfectly symbolized by the Berlin Wall going up in 1961, to the incredibly joyful collapse of communism in 1989 when that exact same wall finally came crashing down. But, the story doesn't just end in some perfect happily ever after unity. As we've all seen with the UK's Brexit in 2016 and Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, modern fractures are continuing to violently test the continent's stability.
The Iron Curtain is honestly the perfect capture of our core pendulum theme. For decades, Europe was violently split right down the middle. On one side, you had a Western half being rebuilt by US aid, integrating economically and defended by NATO democracies. And completely contrasted against that was an Eastern half trapped under Soviet-installed communist regimes linked by the Warsaw Pact, where any sort of political dissent or reform was just brutally suppressed.
So, the crucial dynamic we arrive at today is basically a massive tug-of-war. The modern attempted unity through the European Union has brought open borders and decades of peace, which is amazing. But that is constantly being pushed back against by immense forces of fracture. We're talking about the 2008 financial crisis, rising nationalist movements, Brexit, and of course the devastating return of war to European soil with the invasion of Ukraine. Which leaves us with one final, incredibly provocative question to think about. Is Europe simply too vast, diverse, and complex for any single form of unity to exist permanently? I mean, after 50,000 years of hunter-gatherers settling, empires rising and collapsing, and a pendulum swinging violently between peace and total war, will Europe's destiny always remain contested? Think about that as you process all this history. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer.